Cut. So, interesting news coming out today. President Donald Trump has picked his nominee for vice president. That will be JD Vance, the United States Senator from Ohio. And already, I'm sure you've already heard this news, but absolutely this has become an interesting pick from Donald Trump. Of course, in India, the gentleman in question getting a lot of attention because he's married to Usha Vance, who's of course an Indian-American lawyer. You would have heard of that. But I thought it would be very interesting for us to go into JD Vance. So this is a very interesting pick for a number of reasons that we lay out for you. First of all, JD Vance, just to remind you again, is the senator, which is the Senate is the upper house of the United States. There are 100 senators across the U.S. and each state, there are 50 states in the United States, gets 2 senators. So 50 into 2 becomes 100. And he is one of the senators for the state of Ohio. In fact, he's been a senator since 2022. So, newly arrived in politics. He's just 39 years old and, one of these dynamic young picks for the office of vice presidency. So let's just look at who he is, who is JD Vance, what his politics are, and why exactly Trump picked him. So JD Vance is someone who has acquired a lot of interest. I'm sure Indians are hearing about it for the first time, but in America, the politics and talk about him has been going on for at least a decade. He was born in the state of Ohio, in a small town, to a very, very difficult background. And the reason we know that is because he wrote this amazing book in 2016 called Hillbilly Elegy, which is a book about his upbringing and the time that he spent in Ohio. But very simply, he was born in Ohio in very, very difficult circumstances. His father left him when he was left the family when he was very young. His mother had a difficult battle with drugs for several years, and after that, he somehow managed to make it. He was raised by his grandmother, and he somehow managed to make it through high school. Then he goes off to fight in the United States Marine Corps for several years. He was in fact in the Iraq War as a soldier in the U.S. Marine Corps. So that his military background is something that is extremely important in U.S. politics, something that is always seen as an asset for a politician to have. So graduates comes from a very, very difficult background, goes to fight in Iraq as part of the United States Marine Corps, then comes back, goes to Ohio State University, and also goes to Yale Law School, where he gets a JD degree that allows him to become a lawyer. And so he's got a strong educational background behind him as well. And then he gained some attention as a writer, but really he came to national attention in 2016 when he wrote that book I was just telling you about, Hillbilly Elegy, which was about his story, about coming from a very difficult economic background. And this was extremely important because he was writing in 2016 at the time of Donald Trump's ascendancy to power in the United States. This was an election campaign where a large number of people voted for Donald Trump, and this book, Hillbilly Elegy, was able to explain to a lot of people the cultural circumstances, the economic decline, the anger and the rage that characterized a lot of the communities that voted for Donald Trump, and why they voted for him, and what Trump may have represented to people that voted for him in places like Ohio, places that have seen a lot of economic displacement over the last couple of decades. JD Vance came from one of those families, came from that part of the world. He was able to very powerfully speak to that in his book Hillbilly Elegy. It was a complete bestseller, and it established him as a leading voice. He was still seen, of course, as a conservative, but someone who was a reform-oriented conservative, who wanted to change things, who was able to speak with a great compassion about his background and his and where he was coming from and where he hoped to take the country. So that he was already marked out for great political success at that point in time. But over the last couple of, but of course from 2016 onwards, he did not really appear in the political scene until 2022, when he was nominated by the Republican Party to be its candidate for the Senate seat. Remember, I said there are 100 senators, 2 for every state. So he was nominated to be the Senate candidate for the Republican Party in Ohio, which used to be a very crucial swing state. Now it's seen as fairly safe for the Republicans. But he acquired a lot of support from Donald Trump. And the very interesting thing here is that when he became famous in 2016, JD Vance was very clear that he was actually a never-Trumper. He was someone who was seen as very anti-Trump. In fact, compared him to Hitler at one point in time, compared him to a form of cultural heroine. That was his phrase, not mine. So JD Vance really establishing himself as a critic of Donald Trump in 2016 and what he stood for. But you see, 5 or 6 years later, when he's running for the Senate, he was actually seen as very, very, very close to Donald Trump. In fact, Donald Trump's endorsement was seen as something that powered JD Vance to victory in his 2022 Senate election campaign. And remember, at that point in time, JD Vance was just 37 years old. So, of course, someone who's elected to very, very high office, very young, was expected to achieve great things. And now, it seems that things have come full circle for him. He has been nominated to be Vice President of the United States by former President Donald Trump. So if they win the election in November, he will become Vice President of the United States. So, just a meteoric rise. 8 years ago, he was someone who had written a good book. Today, he's been nominated for Vice President of the United States. So it's been an absolutely meteoric rise. Now, you might also, so that's who he is, but what does he actually stand for? And we talk about two things: the domestic politics and the what his elevation might mean for the world more generally. First of all, let's talk about the domestic politics. Again, like I said, he was seen as a never Trump figure, someone who's very strongly anti-Trump. I've been reading a lot of articles about what people used to see about JD Vance, and early on he was seen very much as this young reformist conservative figure who wanted to take the Republican Party and the conservative movement in a more economically and socially inclusive direction. But over the last couple of years, over the last 6 to 8 years, in fact, he's increasingly turned into someone who has bought in to Donald Trump's sort of national populism and his more abrasive style of politics. So lots of people are saying that JD Vance is in some ways a sellout. He was someone who wanted to be reformist, who wanted to be moderate, but in pursuit of political power, he's changed his political brand completely. He used to be anti-Trump, now he's the most pro-Trump guy around. So lots of, today when his nomination was announced, lots of angry pieces about JD Vance, and simply the idea that he has essentially given up everything that he stood for to advance politically, because his political views have done a full 180 over the last 8 years. So that's domestic politics. One part of it is, of course, what he stands for is very much now he's seen as a more serious version of Trump. So he's seen as someone who can articulate Trump's philosophy and his position and his style, but also have serious policy positions. So he's seen as a post-Trump Trump, which is that what happens once Trump moves on, because Trump is famously not someone who's an attentions to details guy, but JD Vance is seen as that sort of figure. So this is seen as exact one move towards a new form of Trumpism, which is more serious, which is more policy oriented, and can actually do the difficult job of governing. So that's one bit of the reputation that JD Vance has. Another bit of the reputation and what his elevation means is that he's a very interesting figure, because remember, he articulates this this anger of working class people. He himself talks about his working class background, but of course he's also been a venture capitalist, earning big bucks in Silicon Valley. He has deep ties to that part of America. He was in fact backed by Peter Thiel, who some of you may know as the billionaire Silicon Valley entrepreneur who has backed very prominent political causes, including Donald Trump. So there's this interesting balance here where he is seen as the voice of working class voters, but also someone who has deep connections in America's ultra wealthy elite. So he's seen as, in many ways, the future of the Republican Party, which is a party that is populist, a party that can stoke popular anger, but also stoke popular anger against the elites, may I say, but it's also deeply connected with those elites, sort of Latin American style, if any of you are familiar with that style of politics. So that's exactly what JD Vance seems to be representing on the domestic sphere. On the foreign policy sphere, is very, very interesting, because lots of people have begun commenting on what he said, and in a nutshell, some of the comments that he's made in the past may have worried some of America's allies. He's, for example, very famously stated, JD Vance, that he does not care about what happens to Ukraine. Essentially, his point is that America does not have the resources to fight a war in Ukraine, to fight a war in the Middle East, and to also take on China at the same time. His view is very simply that we need to have a much more limited sense of America's global role. It can't be the kind of global superpower that can fight 3 wars at the same time. He's talked very articulately in many cases about how there is a major lack of supply of munitions and arms for America to play that kind of role anymore, just a physical limitation on what America can do. So his idea is very simply that America has to do fewer things in the world. He was someone who fought in the Iraq war, but then, of course, later, at least today, repudiates that kind of conflict, says very clearly that he does not actually want to fight, globalist wars, as it were. So, of course, he seems like someone who, on the foreign policy front, has a much more restricted view of what America should be standing for, a much more, how should I say, restrained view of how American power should be used on the world stage. So that's something that you have seen. He's also seen to be someone who's strongly pro-Israel. He's also seen to be someone who is strong on places like, on countries like Iran, which the Americans in many cases have believed, or conservative Americans have often believed, is a major national security threat to the United States. He's talked about this major border crisis that America has with Mexico, so that's also a concern that he has articulated on the foreign policy front. But what I wanted to leave you with really was the sense of someone who is articulate, who is intelligent, who has talked about America's role in the world in a way that is lots more restricted, and in a way that is going to get a lot of people in Europe and among America's allies slightly worried about the kind of position that the Trump administration will take on issues like the Ukraine war, on issues like China, on issues like the Middle East. So that's something that's very interesting that you'll have to watch. But just to sum up then, JD Vance, we of course on India Today Global, you'll see this video that we've done on his wife, who she is. So if you're interested in that Indian American angle with JD Vance, that you can catch that. But I hope we've been able to lay out for you who JD Vance is, briefly his life story, what he stands for on the domestic sphere, and what he stands for in foreign policy, which is a much more restrained America on the world stage. But of course, there's a lot of excitement about him and a lot more interest in him. But we'll have to see what happens as we move into the election in the United States in November. Thank you so much for watching India Today Global. We hope we've been able to summarize this topic for you well, and we'll keep you updated with all the latest updates and news from the Republican National Convention and the U.S. election.